China's attempt to talk up the economy, to present itself as being more resilient, to present its technology as being world class, and in many respects it is. But the implication that they're able to stand on their own feet in terms of innovation, I think that's overdone, and I think that the Chinese economy remains extremely fragile.
The other interesting country in Southeast Asia that has got a direct link into Ukraine is North Korea. And Russia's relying on North Korea for 40%, 60% of its ammunition. A lot of long-range missiles. We're starting to see equipment coming in, all the rest of it. You also mentioned the cyber environment. From what I understand, there are 2 internet pipelines into North Korea. One comes from Beijing, that's been there for many, many years, and is relatively low bandwidth. The other comes from Moscow and was provided by the Russian National Railway Company and is very high bandwidth. And just after that was put in, Kim Jong-un's missile program went from being more unreliable than reliable, let's put it that way, to being very reliable most of the time. Do you think both states are using Kim Jong-un, North Korea, as a plausibly deniable little bad boy to do some stirring for them both in the region, but also then Russia's clearly reliant on North Korea for an awful lot of support?
I think certainly. I mean, North Korea, there is mutual suspicion because China has long regarded North Korea as a buffer state against the West. So there will be suspicion in Beijing about Russia getting closer to North Korea, especially with soldiers fighting for the Russians on the front lines in Ukraine, North Korean weaponry. On the cyber front, there's been a suggestion that the Chinese have been facilitating North Korea's hackers, who, when you consider the size of the country and the relative backwardness technologically, at least away from the military, their cyber element is actually pretty good. They're pretty strong. And there's been a lot of suggestions that this has been facilitated by servers in China. And of course, recently, one of the big scams that has emerged is rather than hacking into systems, North Koreans have been posing as freelance IT specialists, apparently based in other parts of the world, and are being employed by Western tech companies under false identities. And so immediately, of course, if you are an employee, you get inside the firewall, you're within the system. And so who needs to hack your way in when you're invited in and you become a freelance tech expert employed by a big company that thinks you're perhaps sitting in London or Berlin or Paris, whereas actually you're in Pyongyang hoovering up everything you can from within that system. So the cyber assets of the North Koreans are quite significant. And I think that China has been very instrumental in facilitating that. And I think that the Russian link now is much closer and stronger than it was. And North Korea has become a very significant player in this. But again, a divisive one potentially between Beijing and Moscow.
Well, it's interesting. What you've described there is North Korea effectively hacking humans, and I've been saying to chief information security officers for years when I talk about cyber in different lectures that I'm not bothered about hacking a network. I'll hack the people that can get into the network, and North Korea are showing how to do that. But getting back to the potential for economic sanctions coming in this Friday, do you think the Chinese economic model could withstand a massive increase in Western sanctions if Donald Trump was serious and started to put 100% tariffs on China, whether it's everything out of China or just Chinese companies that are doing business with Russia?
I think they would be struggling. I think, to me, it's significant that a lot of the trade agreements that China has been signing with third countries, Vietnam is a prime example, so is the UK, there have been provisions within those trade agreements about security, about China. Sometimes China's not mentioned by name, but the implication is pretty clear. Look, you've got to be wary of China. The bigger picture here is to try and exclude China from sensitive supply chains and access to top-end technology. In the case of Vietnam, China has boasted that its dependence on the US market has been reduced they were preparing for the trade war. They say the amount of exports to the US fell to like 15, 16% this year against 20% 5 years ago. But that's been achieved to some extent by redirecting through third countries. Vietnam, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, Thailand, for instance, has been on the receiving end of a lot of Chinese investment. Now, a good proportion of that are either screwdriver factories in that they're assembling components brought in from China, or they are in many cases just relabeling them as made in Thailand, made in Vietnam, made in Malaysia. And the individual governments in those countries are very aware of this and very sensitive to it, and they're worried that they could become targets as a result of it. And they've now become much more vigilant about the incoming Chinese investment. But it's pretty clear that the Trump administration wants to target that redirection of Chinese exports, and that in their agreements with the UK, and it's implicit as well in the discussions with the EU. I mean, the EU has hardened its line considerably on Beijing, partly because of their own experience, particularly with critical minerals and other Chinese abuse of trade practices, but also because of one eye on Trump, because this is an important element in Trump's negotiating with third countries, is that they are increasingly wary in their dealings with Beijing. So for all those reasons, I think that China's attempt to talk up the economy, to present itself as being more resilient, to present its technology as being world class, and in many respects it is. But the implication that they're able to stand on their own feet in terms of innovation, I think that's overdone, and I think that the Chinese economy remains extremely fragile. The property crisis continues. Wasteful investment in infrastructure has fallen. Local government debt is soaring. Employment is an issue, particularly youth unemployment. There are multiple issues facing the economy. And I think for all the efforts by Xi to talk up the economy, there are real issues there. I think as well that he's presenting himself now, Xi, as a champion of free trade, as a champion of globalization, calling for world unity against this sort of wrecking ball coming from Washington. But I don't think that really washes with a lot of countries which have had experience of dealing with China over the years, because China is the master of economic coercion. It's been part of the economic model for decades, even more so under Xi. I mean, they are the masters at weaponizing and using trade, investment and market access as means of coercion. So yes, Trump is hemorrhaging trust among allies and trading partners, but Xi's issue is there was never much trust in the first place. And so it's very difficult to then turn around and say, look, trust me, let's all band together against Trump.
Yeah, well, you touched on one thing there where China seems to have got the United States at least worried, because we had Donald Trump trying to make this minerals deal with Ukraine. And he started talking about rare earth minerals, and you talked about critical minerals there. And China, over the last week or so, seems to be restricting the supply of rare earth minerals to the United States in particular, and other countries, but ones that the US defense industry is wholly reliant on. And that will impact the US defense industry, their ability then to support Ukraine and Israel and other conflicts and their own needs as well. Is the restriction of access to these rare earth minerals that China has got a controlling a lot of control over from the economically viable mines around the world, is that a sign of desperation from China if you're getting into things that are that small economically?
I think in the medium term it could backfire, because there's been a lot of talk over recent years by more far-sighted policymakers and others about the reliance on China for multiple essential goods. And critical minerals, rare earths, have been at the foremost of these warnings. And the liberal democracies have been late to take account of that. And I think that China's use of critical minerals as a bargaining factor. Restricting access almost brought the German car industry, for instance, to a standstill. Now targeting US defense firms has been very effective. But it's rather like when you blow a 0 day, a weapon in your cyber arsenal. That's it. You can't use it again. I think from the point of view of Western Europe or the United States, it's been quite useful because it's shown the danger of dependence. And I think that now countries are scrambling to look at alternative ways of getting those supplies, because we should remember that while it might be called rare earths, I mean, that's a scientific term, they're not rare. These critical minerals in general are available quite broadly. It's just that China has built an unassailable lead in the supply chain for these, and they dominate the processing of these minerals, which is actually a pretty filthy operation. It's one of the reasons why the West was quite pleased for so long to let them get on with it, because the amount of environmental degradation that China was prepared to stomach was far higher than would be the case in a liberal democracy, where it just simply wouldn't be accepted. So there are real obstacles to creating a rare earth, a critical mineral industry. But I think that China's weaponizing that we've seen over recent months has been a real wake-up call, and in the short term, in the medium term, will probably backfire against them.
Interesting. So do you think that China, Xi Jinping was concerned about Vladimir Putin's ambitions to recreate the old Soviet Union again, and therefore have that massive power base that there is, and therefore what his policy is with Russia is really to try and keep it in a weakened state so he can see it as a junior partner in a more aligned multipolar world with China at the center?
Yeah, I mean, they both talk about multipolarity, and for which I normally mean anti-American. But yeah, I mean, China sees itself as the dominant partner. It would never say that, but I think by its actions, it is clear that it is now immensely more powerful than Russia in that partnership. What intrigues me is the clash of these imperialist visions, because they are contradictory. They're both visions of recreating past greatness. Vladimir Putin has the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, recreating the Russian-speaking world. Xi has a China dream, which some of the more forthright nationalists in China regard as recreating the Qing dynasty. They both regard pesky little countries that want self-determination, whether they're Ukraine or Taiwan, as being rather a nuisance and being rather insignificant, whatever their population want. But of course, people forget that while China bangs on about 100 years of humiliation, about unequal treaties, the most unequal treaties and the most humiliation came at the hands of Russia. It is certainly in terms of the amount of land that was grabbed from the Qing dynasty during the 19th century, and vast areas north of the Amur River, the Far East, the Russian city of Vladivostok, Sea Cucumber Bay, as it's known in Chinese. And Russian nationalists haven't forgotten this. Chinese nationalists, haven't forgotten this. And Chinese maps have to show the Chinese names of these old areas and provinces. So here you have two imperialist visions, which ultimately potentially could clash. Yes, they will say we've settled our borders, but in the minds of nationalists on both sides, it's never settled. The Chinese and the Russians are thinking very long term, but that gives us something to talk about next time. Ian, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today on Times Radio Frontline. A pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.